Welcome to Chapter of the Week. Today's book is The Rise of America, Remaking the World Order. New York Times best-selling author, Marin Katusa. Introduction. These days, there is no escaping the new doom and gloom sentiment in America. From the mainstream media to the most partisan of internet blogs, the message is the same. And it's everywhere. The sun is setting on the great American experiment. The U.S. economy is in a state of terminal decline. The dollar will soon become as disposable as toilet paper. If the 20th century was America's, the 21st would be China's. Blah, blah, blah. To all of which I say, not so fast. The reality is quite the opposite. To be sure, disruption is the watchword of the day. Turmoil engulfs us political, economic, social, and a worldwide. Virus-induced recession only highlights it. There will be major economic dislocations, changes in the patterns of international trade, new political alignments and tensions, deep social adjustments, and a reshuffling of the global monetary system. But the big winner is going to be America. I know you don't believe me. And I don't blame you. The opposite view bombards you with the idea that the U.S. is fading as a world power. Day in, day out, with no end in sight. No surprise, because that's what it looks like to the naked eye. The American economy is in tatters, propped up only by stimulus money from Washington. Unemployment is at levels not seen since the Great Depression. Proponents of differing political points of view can no longer talk to one another. Government is floundering, the Federal Reserve is printing too much money, and the dollar is falling in value. Racial tensions that have been simmering for decades are boiling over. And internationally, China is eating our lunch. And so on. You know the drill. It doesn't matter what TV channel you watch or whose blog you read. The only difference is whom the messenger chooses to blame for the received belief that everything is going to hell. You're probably wondering how I can confidently predict the rise of America amidst all this negativity. It's simple. I don't listen to it. It's just a boiling cauldron of opinion, signifying nothing. Instead, I look carefully at what's happening in the world. I have to. I'm an investor. As one of the largest independent financiers in the natural resource sector globally, my personal money is at stake along with the assets of those who invest along with me. Unlike most commentators who freely offer their unsolicited opinions, I have skin in the game. I can't afford to be wrong. Thus, I look at the world the same way I plan my investments according to what's out there, not what I agree with or not what I would like to be out there. What is? I pay no attention to pontifications such as, "We've never been here before," or "The country has never been so divided." Nonsense. America, as a nation, has been down this road before. America has suffered much, much worse. How have people forgotten that the U.S. once had a civil war that nearly tore the country in two? That the early 20th century featured labor/management strife so bad that blood ran rivers in the streets? That a 10-year depression caused near intolerable stress that often exploded into violence? That the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s generated reactions that ranged from attack dogs to police riots? It doesn't take an Einstein-level intellect to realize that there has never been much of a period in the U.S. when different groups of people weren't at one another's throats. Even COVID-19 is nothing new. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19 sprang from a virus that was both more easily transmitted and far more lethal than COVID-19. It is estimated to have infected 500 million people, almost one-third of the world's population at the time. The global death toll was at least 50 million. About 675,000 Americans died. If COVID-19 achieves the same mortality rate as the 1918 Spanish flu, well over 2 million will have to die in the U.S. alone to be comparable on a population percentage basis. The point is that bad stuff happens, and when it does, the United States of America gets through it. Americans are an amazingly resilient lot and are especially at their best when their backs are to the wall. At the time the country entered World War II, it was woefully unprepared. Yet, in an astonishing turnaround, within 4 years, it had fashioned the most powerful military in the history of the planet and is the main reason German is not now the spoken language in London nor Japanese in San Francisco. In fact, the U.S. military is still present in over 600 bases in over 70 nations as of late 2020. Do not forget the United States. Geography provides an advantage over every other nation in the world. A friendly neighbor in the north, Canada, oceans on its boundaries, and the Rocky Mountains and Mississippi River. Locations provide the U.S. a geographical barrier from invasion that no other nation on the planet has. The United States has an incredible mineral endowment for the elements required in the 21st century. Not only does the United States have incredible hydrocarbon reserves, both onshore and off, but it has the unique position to be a global leader in wind, solar, hydro, including geothermal, and nuclear energy. The United States is in another rough patch, no question. Economically, politically, socially, you name it. But America is made for this. The nation will come out the other side, stronger than ever. Count on it. Recovery won't happen overnight, but of one thing I am certain. Deep within the soil of the current discontent, the seeds of a brighter future have been planted and are sprouting the rise of America. In this book, I will show you why you should ignore the naysayers as I do. The world is changing by forces that you are probably unaware of at the moment, but you won't be in the dark for long. You will very shortly become aware of the planetary makeover that is underway right now. You will be a part of it and will benefit from it financially and socially, because the rise of America is at stage center. Chapter 1. The New Normal. The new normal is not normal, not by any definition you can think of. And I'm not talking about the dislocations caused by COVID-19. Those have been painful, but they are not permanent. Though it'll take time, the dark days wrought by the virus will pass, the economy will recover. No, I'm talking about more basic changes that will be enduring. Economics, politics, debt, credit, even money itself all are being redefined radically. Yet much of what is happening is entirely out of the public view. More than that, the voices of discord are so loud that they are drowning out the voices of reason. In titling this book The Rise of America, I realize that I may well become an object of scorn. A lot of people don't believe that things are going to get better. Many probably don't even want things to get better if that doesn't fit their agenda. Ignore them. They're wrong. The rise of America will happen. In fact, it has already begun, right in the faces of those who'd rather it didn't. Much of what you will read in the following pages will be news to you. But I want to emphasize that this is not because I have access to documents that bear the government's top secret stamp. There is not some evil conspiracy dedicated to keeping you out of the loop. There's nothing here that isn't publicly available. It's all sitting there in plain sight. The reason much of it will come as a surprise is that we depend on the mainstream media or the internet or both to keep us informed about the world, and those outlets have fallen down on the job. Making sense of the larger issues of the day is hard work. You first have to dig out the relevant information, and then you have to connect some dots. Few people these days, politicians, journalists, economists, whatever, are inclined to put in the time. And in my experience, fewer still manage to connect the dots in the proper sequence. So, while there are certainly those who wish to mislead us deliberately, there are many more who do not themselves understand what's going on. Small wonder that so many citizens are angry, alienated, or merely confused. I want to show you how and why the rise of America will proceed, regardless of the naysayers' nonsense that often seems like the only thing we hear. That's what this book covers. To begin, historically, under capitalism, businesses and individuals who need capital are prepared to offer a reasonable return rate to individuals or institutions who have capital to lend. Sometimes one or the other party gets the upper hand, but the free market tends to sort things out. That system hardly exists anymore. Like it or not, governments now play a major role in determining who has access to and who can use capital. In a sense, they chessboard. Let's take a closer look. A nation must have a workable monetary system to remain stable. Note that I didn't say a sound monetary system. Here are plenty of very smart people who will argue that we haven't had a sound monetary system since Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971. I'm not going to argue with them. As I said, it's immaterial what I, or anyone else, for that matter, thinks should be. We have what is. That's our reality. I neither deny it nor pray for something better. Remember my first principle. I am an investor by trade, and I always play the hand I'm dealt, not the one I wish I had. Though I come at this book's themes from an investor's perspective, it is not an investment guide. But for those interested, I lay out my personal investment framework and specific strategies. The Fed deals, we play our cards. Right now, the Federal Reserve of the United States is doing the monetary dealing. And that will be the case for the foreseeable future. It makes no difference if Fed policy is sound or unsound. Only the long run will tell us that. But at least for the moment, it appears workable, despite all the voices of objection. We play these cards because there is no alternate universe in which we get different ones. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself at this point, but Fed's new normal is affecting and will affect our lives. The global economy is addicted to fiscal stimulus and low interest rates. I will explain modern monetary theory in detail in Chapter 3, but first, I want to discuss the Federal Reserve framework under Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen, President Biden's pick for U.S. Treasury Secretary. The plan will be a looser version of fiscal monetary coordination, much like what occurred from 1942 to 1951, but not MMT quite yet. A replay of 1942 to 1951 Federal Reserve framework. As I will cover in detail later in the book, many writings exist about the Federal Reserve during the timeframe between 1906 and the end of FDR's New Deal in 1939. However, very little exists about the critical 1939 to 1951 timeframe that laid the groundwork for a long-term debt cycle that funded the build-out of America's vast Western infrastructure expansion after World War II. Also, something few talk about today is that the Federal Reserve was successful in the 1940s with its yield curve control, which is a very important aspect of its framework. America would not have undergone the incredible expansion to the western frontier of the United States, building the largest dams for energy utilities, steel mills, and other manufacturing facilities to establish a wider supply chain without the collaborative work between Congress and the Federal Reserve. This period was the first in America's history when there was extended fiscal and monetary coordination between the Federal Reserve and Congress. This period was the first of fiscal monetary coordination. Let us jump to the present. In 2021, infrastructure in the United States needs a major upgrade. Infrastructure doesn't refer to just roads, bridges, and schools. It refers to manufacturing an electrical grid to supply chains to technology training. And if the United States isn't able to upgrade its workforce, workplace, and infrastructure, it will find itself in much the same place England found itself in post-World War I. England did not invest in keeping up with Germany's growth and, as a result, ended up trading its vast global empire for survival after World War II. But America's equivalent to Germany is China, with assistance from Russia, and we have time to prevent suffering the same fate as England. China is investing heavily in its infrastructure, technology, and weapons. Will America invest in its future? It has no choice but to do so, and I will explain why and how investors can benefit from such a move. A major clue was what happened on Thursday, August 27, 2020. On that day, Jerome Powell, chair of the Open Market Committee, outlined the new playbook for the U.S. Federal Reserve, setting policy for many years into the future. He did this at the end of summer to give the markets, regardless of which party won the election, a framework for stimulating a sluggish economy moving forward. The guidelines are essentially an official U.S. modern version of fiscal monetary coordination. Many are saying the Federal Reserve will fail at yield curve control. That may happen, but as I mentioned before, it succeeded in the 1940s and nothing new is being applied on that front this time around. That said, many argue that it was the confirmation of modern monetary theory, the current successor to the Keynesianism that preceded it. If this is the case, this is a revolutionary change, and I do mean revolutionary. All investors need to understand what MMT is, what it portends, and how fiscal monetary coordination and modern monetary theory are integral to the rise of America. That is not a simple subject. For me to fully explain, it will require a chapter unto itself. See Chapter 3. Suppose Congress fails to coordinate with the U.S. Federal Reserve in making the long-term investments now needed to compete with China. In that case, FMC will fail, and MMT will be the framework that will be relied upon to move forward. MMT is a modern take on FMC except for one significant difference. With FMC, deficits and national debt matter, and within the theory of MMT, deficits and national debt don't matter. For now, suffice it to say that the Fed's focus is twofold: create inflation and prevent deflation from ever taking hold. Do whatever it takes to create maximum employment. Powell admits that while the U.S. is in recession, it is teetering on the edge of something worse, a deflationary depression. Now, many of you will remember the 1970s, when the country experienced double-digit inflation. The fear was that it would continue at a high level or even get worse. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of a currency and is disastrous for workers whose wages aren't keeping pace with prices. The country needed help, and Paul Volcker turned out to be the man to do it. Volcker, appointed to chair the Federal Reserve, was the last inflation fighter to hold the position. He raised interest rates to nosebleed levels, decreased the money supply, and put the brakes on the flow of capital. With 30-year mortgages pushing past 16% interest rates, it was full-bore shock therapy, extremely painful, but it worked. Slowly, inflation subsided, and the economy found a productive equilibrium. It is worth reminding ourselves that there are always good investment opportunities, no matter what the economy is doing. Those who took advantage of late-70s CDs paying 18% in interest were very happy campers. You who remember those gloomy years might think that the specter of excessive or even hyperinflation would always be the paramount worry on the Fed's collective mind, but you would be wrong. Since Volcker, every chair Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, and Powell has presided over a 180-degree turn, the Fed no longer acts as an inflation foe. On the contrary, it actively promotes tie-in, albeit at a level that it determines is both controllable and benign, defined as a net positive for economic growth. The Federal Reserve considers 2% inflation to be the magic number. In a later chapter, I will explain why 2% inflation is the target by the Federal Reserve. Its primary role now is as a deflation preventer, and its primary message is to say never again to the 1930s, or, as Jerome Powell might put it, not on my watch. Deflation is deemed the planet's nastiest bête noire. Yet, with a mighty shove from the pandemic lockdown, that's where the economy is headed. To counter the deflation and attempt to foster inflation, the Fed will use the two primary tools in its box. First, Powell has signaled the Fed's willingness to keep interest rates near zero for the foreseeable future, even for 5 years. He stated that the Fed will also tolerate the economy running above the 2% inflation rate that is its long-term target, at least for some time if inflation can rise that much. Using the Fed's metric of inflation, we are not there yet. How did the 2% inflation rate become the target for central bankers? The first central bank to publicly announce an inflation target was the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in 1989. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand was dealing with 7.6% inflation when Don Brash, the head of the central bank, announced a 2% inflation target. 2 years later, New Zealand succeeded, and the inflation rate was 2%. Central bank after central bank around the world adopted the 2% inflation target. So why was it 2%? Believe it or not, there was no serious math or economics behind the decision. The powers to be debated between 0% and 2% targets, and decided 2% could be achievable. However, I have a different take. Between 1834 and 1971, when the gold standard began and ended, the average annual growth rate of gold production was 2%. Coincidence? I think not. Powell gave no indication how far beyond 2% inflation the Fed would tolerate, nor for how long. But they'll do what they feel they have to do, including not only zero interest rates and higher inflation, but also yield curve control and possibly even negative interest rate policy, NIRP, both of which I explore in detail later. Second, as you might expect, they will create boatloads of money. And from where is all this money coming? It, of course, comes from thin air. Or, as Chairman Powell said in a 60 Minutes interview in 2020, we print it digitally. So, we as a central bank, we can create money digitally, and we do that by buying treasury bills or bonds or other government guaranteed securities. And that actually increases the money supply. We also print actual currency, and we distribute that through the Federal Reserve banks. Free money. Free money. Hey, what's not to like? As Glenn Fry sang in his classic Smuggler's Blues, it's the lure of easy money. It has a very strong appeal. Indeed, it does for bankers and politicians every bit as much as for smugglers, and money is especially easy when you can print your own. But here is the cold, hard truth. The global economic markets need the leadership and support of the central bankers, and without their actions, the economy would be much worse off than it currently is. So, if staving off deflation requires the creation of trillions of digital dollars, well, that's what it takes. In so doing, the Fed may eventually embrace MMT and decide to let the chips fall where they may. As you will see in Chapter 3, MMT proponents believe that our traditional concept of money is passé. Money used to be tangible, bits of precious metal or the paper exchangeable for that metal, but today's paper currency and coins are little more than vestigial remnants of times past. Most of what is now called money are just entries in a giant logbook that doesn't even have a physical existence. The Federal Reserve has a digital cloud that serves as a credit/debit ledger, which logs an increase in the money supply when issuing credit and a decrease when receiving debt repayments when taxes are collected. In a sense, the credit/debit ledger doesn't even record real transactions. Money creation doesn't run up debt. Instead, it is government investment in the economy, and enhanced economic strength is itself the repayment. Or so they say. I hope they're right, because the truth is that no one knows if MMT will work and for how long? Fiscal monetary coordination. Work after World War II FOT America, and that would be the logical framework for the current administration. Still, MTT will be the fallback if it doesn't work, and that's why I want to discuss it in this book. But proponents point to Japan as the poster child. Over there, the government has been fighting a major deflation for 25 years through money creation that, as a percentage of GDP, exceeds that of the US. Its economy, while hardly robust, has nevertheless been kept afloat. And the terrible inflation that should have happened yet hasn't yet put in an appearance. One don't try to fight the federal, its policies are working for the moment. The stock market and bond market have not only accepted that MMT policy is the way moving forward, but more importantly, have become totally dependent on the expected stimulus of MMT. The current fiscal and monetary policy is like a gray area between FMC and MMT. I also believe this policy will be in place for years, if not decades, and is integral to the rise of America. I make my plans accordingly. So should you. The only thing that's likely to bring down the Fed and VMMT is a crisis of faith, which I will explain in Chapter 3. It will occur when the greedy politicians who control Congress attempt to control and influence the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. All money, even the physical kind, has its ultimate existence only in the human mind. A unit of currency is valuable to the extent that people value it. As long as people accept it in trade, it's sound. Once they don't, it goes to currency heaven. It's all about faith. Zimbabwe-style monetary catastrophes happen when a nation's citizens collectively lose faith in their money. So, ask yourself, have Americans or even the world lost faith in the US dollar? Hardly. Unless they are currency traders, investors need to focus on the longer-term trend of currencies. There has been selling pressure on the US dollar since the stock market crash of late March 2020. According to the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, the buck dropped about 10% against a basket of other currencies between late March and mid-September of 2020. However, if you go back just a few months earlier to January 1, 2020, the US dollar is up during 2020 compared to the same basket of currencies. The same can be said when you look back 5 years and 10 years. However, many commentators use a small time frame of the US dollar's decrease to that basket of currencies in mid-2020 to push their narrative that the dollar is collapsing. It isn't. Think about it. When investors get nervous, when whole countries battle insolvency, where do they run? To the world's reserve currency, the one where international trade occurs, and the only one everybody trusts more than any other fiat currency, the US dollar. What's going to challenge it? The euro? Europe's in worse economic straits than the US. The British pound is not going to stage an epic comeback. The yuan? Seriously, despite China's burning desire to become an economic superpower, you have to ask the obvious question: who's going to switch their allegiance to a currency controlled by a communist government? I am not trying to downplay the power China currently yields. The yuan, the currency of China, is becoming more viable quickly, and China and many nations within Europe are moving forward on trade deals. Many nations will continue to complain about dollar dependence.